How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the first tier list video of the new RCQ season. This week, there's no consideration for Outlaws of Thunder Junction. The set wasn't released on Magic Online in time for this data, and most players won't have their new decks for the first week of the RCQs. Since it's been a while, let's start with some tier list definitions. First up is the S tier. Play these decks, or your chances of winning are greatly diminished. Next up, we have the A tier. These are the top decks and super viable to win your RCQ, especially when there isn't any singular S tier deck. After that, we have the B tier. These are strong decks, and the last of the recommended choices to win. They have a high likelihood to top 8, but not quite to win in the same degree as A or S. Next up, we have C tier, and these can be good meta calls to top 8, but they need the right circumstances to win. Last up, we have D tier. And you should keep these decks on your radar. They're likely to show up, but they're really unlikely to win your local events. Just a reminder, any deck that doesn't show up on the tier list doesn't speak to its playability, just to its likelihood to win your local events. So if your goal is to take down your local RCQ, I'd recommend staying on the tier list, especially towards the top if you can. This week, we don't have any S tier decks. Even though there are some really dominant decks in the metagame, not one single one stands out above the rest, so we're going to keep S tier open this week. Next up, the D tier. Keep in mind, these are decks you should have on your radar, but aren't very likely to win your local event. Since these aren't your top choices, if you can help it, I'm going to kind of go through them quick, but I have a couple of data highlights from the past week for 2 of the decks. For D tier, we have Enigmatic Incarnation, Transmogrify, specifically looking at the blue-red version, though the Jund version did show up. Is It Creativity, Mono-Red Aggro, Golgari Fight Rigging, Mardu Heroic, and Mono Green Devotion. When we look at the decks that managed to put up top 8s in this week's challenges, the only 2 from the D tier were the Blue-Red Transmogrify deck and Enigmatic, both with 1 top 8. Next up, we're going to the C tier. Here we start seeing the decks that were able to put up more consistent results and are definitely in the running to be putting up top 8s consistently, though they need a little bit of luck to get the win. First up, we have Quintorius Combo. This new deck coming out in the last couple events as far as putting up a lot of top 8s, especially after the Arena Championship, where it put up a 2nd place finish in Explorer. We're starting to see it make its way into Pioneer. When we're looking at the data, we're going to look at the overall metagame on Magic Online, the Premier metagame, which is your prelims and challenges, your winners metagame, which is your 3-1s and 4-0s and prelims, and your top 32 for challenges, and then the top 8s for challenges. For Quintorius, it was 3% across the board, 3% overall, 3% Premier, 3% in the winners metagame, but where it stood out was with 3 top 8s in the challenges. The deck hasn't been getting a lot of play, but it's been putting up strong results. Next up, we have Azorius Control. This one's a little bit odd in that in the overall metagame, it was putting up 5%, but as we moved to the Premier, it moved to 4%, to the winners metagame down to 3%, and it only put up 2 top 8s across all the challenges. This feels like a deck that should be performing better, but just isn't quite able to find its footing against the top decks in the metagame. Next up, we have Spirits, and this one's almost cheating a little since we're going to combine blue-white Spirits and mono-blue Spirits, but the breakout for each is 2% overall metagame for both blue-white and 2% for mono-blue, 2% in each for the Premier metagame, 2% in the winners metagame for blue-white, but only 1% in mono-blue. But then we look at the top 8 challenges, 1 for blue-white, but 2 for mono-blue. It's interesting to see the deck perform at such a varying level as far as what number of people are playing it, but the top 8s are interesting to see 2 for mono-blue, but only 1 for Azorius. Next up, we have Mono Black Discard, a real favorite of mine, and I'm glad to see it starting to pick up even more play. It had 7% of the overall online metagame, with 8% in the Premier metagame, but only 6% in the winners metagame. With 3 top 8s, it's pretty consistent with some of the other decks in its tier. It's probably the closest to be moving up to B until Quintorius gets some more play. Definitely a strong deck, but just a step shy of the other top decks. Next up, we have the B tier. And remember, these are strong decks and kind of the bottom of my recommendation. It's pretty likely you'll see these in your top 8, but to win, things gotta fall just the right way. First up, we have Lotus Field. This deck continues to be a pain for a lot of players. It really is an example of players who know what they're doing with the deck way outperforming, but with 8% of the overall metagame and 8% of the Premier metagame, it seems like players have started to really take this as their combo option of choice. With 9% of the winners metagame and 6 top 8s, it really outperformed expectations. options. If you're a good and confident Lotus pilot, I think it's a really great option for surprising some people who are ready for other decks in the metagame. Next up, we have Izidin Soul, which has been on the rise lately. From last week, I wrote about it starting to get some play percentage. This week, it really jumped up with 8% overall metagame, 7% in the Premier metagame, but 11% in the Winners metagame, putting up a huge percentage of people doing well with this deck, and I think it's still a little underrated and disrespected. It also put up 4 top 8s, putting it in good shape to show that it could convert, and even took down a challenge. Next up, we have Nivtalite, which has continued to show up at a pretty good rate, putting up challenge wins week after week, and is definitely looking like the premier mid-range deck with 8% across the board overall Premier and Winners metagame and 4 top 8s, including a challenge win. It's definitely your best option if you're looking to play fair Magic. Last up, we have Amalia Combo. This deck really took off in the last couple months with its ability to shut down aggro as well as kill people somewhat out of nowhere, playing some of the best creature spells in Collected Company, Court of Calling, Return to the Ranks, making it very difficult to attack from all axes. With 7% in the overall and Premier metagame, it also had an 11% in the Winners metagame. This is another one of those decks that top pilots are doing really well with, but it does take a little bit of getting used to the different kinds of lines and how you best should be supporting your combo. The deck also finished with 4 top 8s, kind of in line with a lot of the other decks in this tier. Last up, we have the A tier, and these are your top decks. They could be an S tier just given the difference between how played these decks are compared to the rest, but given there's 2 of them, they're both kind of equal to each other, and we have seen a lot of top results from other decks. I don't quite think either one is ready to be S tier, but these are the 2 decks you need to understand how to play against, you need to know your sideboard for, or you should be playing them. They are the best decks in the format, and they deserve your preparation going into your RCQs. First up, we have Rakdos Vampires. This had a huge showing at the last Pro Tour. Everyone who's been prepping for Pioneer knows about this deck. Sorin into Vein Ripper is just a monstrous combination if you're not prepared for it, with 18% overall metagame, 19% in the Premier, and 16% Winners metagame, along with 8 challenge top 8s. It's clear it's a step above just about everything else in the format other than the other A tier deck. That is Izzet Phoenix. It feels like this deck never dies. It did disappear for a bit, but in reality, it's hard to ever get past this deck and bury it for good. The power level of your card draw, your interaction is just too high, and your sideboard plans and ability to pivot make it very hard for even graveyard hate or other kinds of targeted hate to disrupt you. With 17% of the overall metagame, 18% of the Premier metagame, and topping the charts with 18% of the Winners metagame, along with 9 top 8s, Phoenix had the best weekend of all the decks, and it's hard to see Vampires of Phoenix going away even with the release of Outlaws of Thunder Junction. So if you're looking to win your next event, start here with Phoenix or Vampires and go from there. And there you have it. That's this week's Pioneer tier list. One of the things I really want to highlight is the parity among the top decks to a degree. While you still have Vampires and Phoenix sort of one step above the rest, there's a lot of decks putting up a lot of good percentages and a lot of wins, including taking down the challenges where Vampires and Phoenix are a lot of the top 8. If you know your deck well, have a strong plan against the top decks, and you have a proactive plan to end the game, almost any of these top decks are viable in Pioneer, and that's a good place to be heading into a set that looks like it'll give us a lot of new interesting cards. Keep an eye out next week as we finally get to see how Outlaws of Thunder Junction does in the metagame, and until next time.